we'll get started with our second panel, which is on reverence and humility. We'll follow the same format as before. Our panelists will speak, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So we have three great panelists here, Elisa Grimi, Beth Rath, and Dr. John Crosby.
So good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. And it has been a long journey, but I'm really happy to be here. And when you are happy, as also Dietrich von Hildebrand remember us, you can always say thank you. So thank you, everybody, and first of all, to John Henry and Catherine and all of you. So in order to be able to address the topic of our group by offering a new insights into current reality, I think one of the most enchanting things about Hildebrand's thought is that it is able to speak to each person today. It has to say something for the today present, and I decide to organize this very short talk into 3 points. So my contribution is intended to offer insights, and when I decided to come here, my first interest was to listen to the debate that may result from offering you these insights. So firstly, I illustrate in 2 lines why Hildebrand talks about reverence. It was interesting for me, in offering the translation of The Art of Living to Italian audience, to rediscover this word, a word that in Italian is as obsolete as ever, that could be found in the etiquette, so in the Galateo, the rules of the polite behavior, by the Florentine Giovanni della Casa. There seems to be no longer in fashion at tables, when during a candlelight dinner one would reverently move the chair to sit the guest. Irreverently, it then happened when it was some bully who pushed the chair aside, that the guest is unwelcome would fall with his ass on the floor. Well, here then is what Hildebrand teaches us instead to avoid thudding on the floor. So the first point is on reverence. So let us look at the structure of the thought articulated by Hildebrand, so the concepts that are involved. And I'm referring here to the first chapter of The Art of Living. In the first chapter of Art of Living, Hildebrand deals with moral values. He writes, positive moral values are the focus of the world. He is quick to point out that man can participate in such moral values given his freedom. They are not given to him by nature like the curls of his head. A virtuous movement is already outlined. It is not a case that the subtitle of the 7th chapter, later republished, bears the name of Wellspring of Virtues. And again, the soul of every morally good attitude is an abandonment to that which is objectively important, is interest in a thing because it has value. And Hildebrand continues his argument by stating that only those who aim at the important in itself can make themselves the bearers of moral values. So let us turn our attention to the concept of importance. And the chapter devoted to it, included in ethics, are well worth picking up on, and we will have a chance this week, fortunately. The important in itself make us look at the essence. Quoting again Hildebrand, the capacity to grasp values, to affirm them, and to respond to them is the foundation for realizing the moral values of man. So, first point, on grasping them. The focus here goes to the famous concept of taking cognizance, because it is precisely in the structure of the narrative that man makes, in the way man knows, and here I'm referring to what is philosophy, that there is the premise of knowing truth, and rather encountering it. Christianity, in this sense, is not primarily a moral question, but a question of knowledge. And this is a point that I think is very interesting and deserves further study on the side, maybe a good topic for a future graduate or PhD dissertation. So it's a problem, firstly, of knowledge, an encounter with truth. Here, a reference goes to the wonderful work, The Heart, that has recently been published also in the Italian translation. Here, Hildebrand is incredibly profound, is deep. He's first proposed an analysis of our art, of how the human heart works. He considered the whole human heart, each aspect. He analyzed all aspects in details, and he does not leave one out. But that heart finds its highest expression in the sacred heart. It is that our heart, to be full, must approach, be transformed, imitate the sacred heart. Beautiful. I found these passages and this intuition incredible. I think, really, this is an incredible passage, full of honesty, very rare to be found in the contemporary moral philosophy, looking in particular to analytical panorama. And even though in phenomenology, with some great exceptions, of course. Well, I found wonderful that passage, and there is no moralism, but a desire for full understanding, the ich et nunc happiness. Second passage, on affirming them, so the values. We have seen that Hildebrand recalls the element that constitutes man and makes him different from all creatures, namely freedom. And finally, there is the responding to them, the third passage. And here the argument cannot refer to the many pages Hildebrand devotes to the theme of responding to value. The reference is ethics. The ability to grasp them, to affirm them, and to respond to moral values, we can in summary say, is present in the human being who is predisposed to be reverent. Hildebrand writes, reverence is the attitude that can be designated as the mother of all moral life. So reverence is a supremely intelligent attitude by definition, while pride precludes the subject from true knowledge, limits its field of acceptance. Indeed, he goes on to say, I quote, reverence is the indispensable presupposition for all deep knowledge. And again, reverence is the presupposition for every response to value, every abandonment to something important, and it is at the same time an essential element of such response to value. The basic attitude of reverence is the prerequisite for all true love. And finally, it takes place in the first chapter, the transition to religion. Indeed, the reverent attitude allows us to fully grasp the other, the essence of value. Therefore, ultimately, reverence as a basic moral attitude stands at the beginning of all religion. This was the first part, so I resume very quickly, these 10 minutes, this chapter. The second point, reverence, it has humility and some misunderstanding. One immediately grasps the connection between reverence and humility. Certainly, the reverent attitude must be full of esteem, otherwise it becomes servile. There cannot be full reverence without there being full humility. I wrote years ago that humility is the ontology of identité. I did a review, an issue of Recherche philosophique, and the essay is titled Humilité, une ontologie de l'identité, so it was in French. So humility is the ontology of identity. For it is only in a humble attitude that we make a sort of tabula rasa toward our neighbor. Not in the sense that there is a kind of annihilation for our knowledge in order to be able to understand that of the person with whom we are dialoguing, which modernity would have us understand, but in the sense that steadfast our knowledge. Precisely that we are steadfast in it, and we can acquire new knowledge. And here, by acquire, I mean the profound sense of the already mentioned concept of taking connaissance. To bring us down to the present, so-called politically correctness is an expression of exactly the opposite conception of humility. Those who propose it do not want to achieve true understanding of the data in question, but to impose their own ideology. Politically correctness is the banner, not surprisingly, of a cancer culture. And here I refer to a recent article written by Remy Bragg, detailing that such culture means and represents. An example from the last few hours. Traveling with a wonderful Canadian line, thinking to my baggage in particular, everything appears under the sign of a multicolored flag. Also, the movies offered were colorfully catalogued. In fact, there was no lack of a pride selection. Then one can see how thinking also channels free choice. I had to choose a movie when I was on my aircraft. So if we wanted to conclude the pride expression, it would be necessary to add proud to be. And then the cataloging itself would also fail. Everything that exists in the difference of being. One can touch the forcing. So we need to return to humility, not to those of the ancient, nor to also what Nietzsche meant, but to Christian humility. Indeed, what ancient morality lacked in order to esteem humility is probably an adequate idea of divine transcendence and the correlative notion of creation. The Greek word tapeinos has an original local meaning and indicates being situated at the bottom, the lowliness, the situation of people in lower social and economic backgrounds. I have no way here to propose the history of the concept in ancient thought, which is very, very interesting. And I suggest a really well-done study, is written in Italian, L'umiltà cristiana, edited by Rath Scalabrini, Sequeri and Circle. In contemporary times, there are few examples dealing with humility with Christian meaning. It is very nice to look at the history of the concept of humility because it is transformed depending on how one considers human being, the man, depending on the anthropological conception. For Auguste Jean-Baptiste Buvet de Crécy, who wrote the Manual des grands et des petits séminaires, où recueille des tests créés sur toutes sortes de sujets classés par ordre alphabétique, so which is a French manual written in 1826 for the training of seminarians. Well, he intended humility as a self-loathing. And according to Nietzsche, however, I quote, in Christianity, the instincts of the submissive and the oppressed come to the fore. It is the lower class that seek their salvation in them. The Christian is the hatred against the spirit. He wrote that. Against pride, courage, freedom, libertinage of the spirit. Christian is the hatred against the sense, against the joys of the senses, against joy in general. So it's the opposite view of Christian humility. Christianity is a revolt of everything that crawls on the ground against that which possesses height. The gospel of the lowly makes lowly and humble. So I go to the conclusion. An exception, however, is for whom humility is the most delicate and the most hidden and the most beautiful of the Christian virtues, as Scheler wrote. The conclusion, the third part, I titled this part, The Believers of the Joy. So, opposite to the perspective of Nietzsche, we found, of course, the sermon of being humble. It's curious how McCart recalls the famous passage from the Deuteronomy, the famous passage, and he called that passage the sermon of being humble, where there is a very beautiful image, and it is the image of a man who discovered the manna. Okay, I quote just a few lines. And thou shalt remember all the way which Jehovah thy God had led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble thee, to prove thee, to know what was in thy heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or not. And he humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know. So humility makes a person feel his or her dependent condition. It is not to be understood as Nietzsche, like to demean, but on the contrary, it has a grand purpose. It makes possible the believer's joys. So see something unexpected. And I want to conclude quoting the Psalm. So delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires to thine heart. Thank you. So,
I'd like to use my few minutes here to focus on how reverence and humility relate to incivility. It's just been something on my mind a lot lately. And I think that incivility is a vice I would argue that especially characterizes the present age. So as I've been thinking through what I wanted to say for today, I was attending to some of the news headlines. That's about all I can take is headlines. And I noted that there have been there's been an assassination attempt, there have been mass shootings, there have been attacks on churches and pro-life facilities, just to name a few. And these are extreme cases of incivility, death threats, shootings over disagreements, and even whole groups being canceled because of differences in beliefs. But there are less extreme cases of incivility as well. So I think about name-calling on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, between those on the political left and those on the political right, and even some dismissiveness of among people who disagree regarding, say, the recent Dobbs decision from just a few days ago. So civility and incivility are on my mind because I think our times are marked by a crisis of civility. We use those words, being civil and uncivil, but it occurred to me, maybe I don't really know what I'm saying. What does it mean to be civil? What does it mean to be uncivil? And might Hildebrand have something to say about this? And I suggest to you that our readings on reverence and humility for this panel hold the keys to understanding civility and incivility. In his reflection on humility, Hildebrand distinguishes between different types of pride. Pride in all its forms is understood to be directly opposed to humility. And the most extreme and worst kind of pride is satanic pride. A person marked by satanic pride is enslaved to his self-interest, and every action, every object that he sees is looked at from the lens of how will it satisfy me? Does it bring me pleasure, or is it unpleasant? Is it useful to me or somehow unuseful to me? This sort of person, the person marked by satanic pride, is value blind. We've heard that term before in the last panel. And what I mean by this is that the person is so filled up with himself, his own ego. As Jim said, ego spasm, I think was the word, right? This person is so filled up with himself that the values inherent in objects are imperceptible to him. As Hildebrand puts it, so he says, the prideful person does not leave to being the space that it needs in order to unfold itself. The world, then, for the prideful man, according to Hildebrand, is, and here I quote him, flattened before his impertinent and stupid gaze. He can't bear it. The prideful man cannot bear something being valuable or important in itself because that would infringe on his absolute sovereignty, that there could possibly be something outside of me that calls forth a response from me. And Satan, as we know, wants to be sovereign over all. He will not serve, not just God, but anything of value, because that stifles his authority and his attempt at self-supremacy. There are lots of kinds of pride, different types of pride. Many of them are less severe than this all-encompassing satanic pride, but what all forms of pride have in common is value blindness, whether that's total value blindness, perhaps in the case of satanic pride, or value blindness that's relegated just to some particular set of values. Incivility, I want to argue, is a symptom and sister vice of pride. At the root of uncivil attitudes and behaviors is a failure to recognize values. The uncivil man refuses to be silent in the face of that which is important and to let those things unfold in their being before him, to touch him somehow. One of the chief values, I would say, that the uncivil person obscures is the value of persons. All persons have intrinsic value, not measured by one's contribution to society or how much money that person makes, how many children the person has. As soon as one becomes blind to the intrinsic, infinite value of the human person, one starts to see persons as something useful or unuseful, an aid or an obstacle to satisfying my own desires or furthering my own projects or plans. So again, the uncivil person, I think, is chiefly marked by this blindness to the intrinsic value of persons. A second value, I suggest, that the uncivil person obscures is the value of true community. Again, the prideful man refuses to be subordinate, and community, whether that's our family, our university, our parish, our city, state, our nation, community requires that we consider the common good, which sometimes means that our own subjective satisfaction be sacrificed. The uncivil man, though, cannot see the good of community and cannot see self-sacrifice for the sake of community, for the common good, as a possibility for himself. Again, he will not serve. And so it's not hard to see why some of today's uncivil acts are occurring. Why would someone try to assassinate a Supreme Court justice? Well, the assassin sees no value in that justice's human life, but rather sees that man as an obstacle to promoting his ideology. Why would someone open fire on African Americans at a supermarket? That man, once again, was blind to the intrinsic value, the intrinsic dignity of all human persons, no matter their skin color. Hildebrand, I don't think, would be hopeless, however, in the face of today's incivility. I think Hildebrand would see a remedy for today's incivility, not so much or not primarily in policy changes, but rather growth in virtue, particularly the virtues of reverence and humility. Reverence, as we've heard, is the most basic moral disposition, this most basic fundamental attitude, and it allows for the possibility of other virtues. And how so? Well, reverence is about having our eyes open and fixing our gaze upon other beings. We allow those beings to unfold before us, to speak to us, that is, to reveal their value to us. And human persons, of course, are beings of infinite value. And as with all beings, a habit of reverence would allow us to grasp this value. An appropriate response to a being of infinite value, like a person, would never be destruction or even the slightest incivility. Instead, once we grasp the value of a person created in God's image and likeness, we properly respond with love. And that love can manifest itself in different forms that are, of course, proper to the office of the relationship. So maybe it's just basic civility or respect. Maybe it's a deep love of friendship. Maybe, if that being happens to be God, that would be worship. That would be the proper response. For Hildebrand, humility, too, is a virtue foundational for moral life and civilization, and it is the antithesis of pride. The proud man, again, refuses to recognize values because that would be a matter of submitting himself, which he won't do. His gaze is always upon himself. And I was thinking about Dante as I was putting this together, and Dante just gives a lovely example or illustration of what the prideful man is like. So he's punished for all eternity, bent over with the weight of a rock on his back, and what does he get to look at forever? Well, his dirty feet and the humus, the ground. Humus being the Latin root for humility. So the truly humble man, though, is not one who just looks at the ground, I would say. And I think Hildebrand would say, the humble man has his focus outward. He's one who sees and grasps the objective values in persons and things around him. That is, the values that they have independently of whether they further his projects and interests. By recognizing the values in things themselves, the humble man submits himself to values. And that's not to say that when a person recognizes the value in a symphony or a great work of art, that he thinks somehow that that work of art is more important than himself, more important than a human being. But rather, it means he sees how something could be good and important in itself. Again, whether or not he finds it pleasant or useful. And then the humble man offers the appropriate response to values. Maybe it's awe in the face of the Grand Canyon, or maybe it's gratitude for a thoughtful gift received. The humble man is one who also contemplates his own faults and weaknesses and his constant possibility of falling into sin. Indeed, Hildebrand goes even further, and this is a point that I found to be rather controversial. Maybe it's something that we can talk about after. So Hildebrand says, and here I'm going to quote him, he says that humility proscribes, not prescribes, but proscribes, all contemplation of one's own values, nor does it even tolerate any keen consciousness of them. So he's talking about looking at your own virtues, thinking about how kind or courageous or temperate you are, or giving yourself a pat on the back for a good deed that you've done, looking around as you give the poor person food to eat, as we heard from the last panel. Hildebrand says that looking at your own virtues eviscerates them. It takes the guts out of them, strips them of their goodness, leaving a mere hollow shell. And why? That's because the man who is kind and courageous and temperate is the way he is because of the values that he perceives and responds to in the world. His aim isn't to collect virtues like a person might collect stamps. Add one to the collection, and then you maybe collect them all, and you congratulate yourself on that. That's not how it works in the moral life. Okay, so humility then, my point here, is essential for civility. The humble man not only submits himself to other values in the world and responds appropriately, but also considers his own weaknesses, the great abyss between himself and God, and acknowledges that whatever he has is a gift from God. If one keeps one's gaze firmly fixed on objective values, on God, who's the giver of values, and on one's own weakness, then I would suggest one has laid the foundation for civility. The real question then that I think about for myself, and I suggest could be fruitful for all of us here, is to ask, where is my gaze? Is it navel gazing? Am I looking upon myself all the time, my own virtues, my own triumphs? Or am I looking outward? Am I gazing upon and grasping values out there and then correcting myself when I start engaging in that navel gazing? And once we do that, I think we're on our way to greater civility. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth and Elisa. Good morning. Welcome to this session. It's a tremendous pleasure for me to see so many friends and former students and be together with you in these deliberations today. I want to pick up on a theme from Elisa's presentation, namely the suspicion of humility that a thinker like Nietzsche showed. Now, humility is often not appreciated because it seems to be nothing more than a kind of servility, a doormat mentality, an inability to stand up for oneself, and a susceptibility to be dominated and used. This is just the way Nietzsche looks at Christian morality. He thinks that Christians dress up servility as a splendid virtue so that they will be admired rather than scorned when their weakness becomes apparent. And it must be said, sometimes Christians themselves play into the hands of Nietzsche and construe humility in a way that at least seems to have some stamp or residue of humility, of servility. Now, it's one of the great merits of von Hildebrand's analysis of humility that, on his telling, humility is entirely invulnerable to the Nietzschean suspicion. True humility, he says, is the very opposite of servility. Now, von Hildebrand gives plenty of attention in the chapter on humility to servility. In one place, he describes it like this: the servile person, he says, is like a whipped dog who allows himself to be treated in any and every way, accepting the most humiliating situations without any effort at self-defense. End of that quote. The servile person then is weak. He's a creature of lack. Whereas the humble person takes a definite stance, as we will see. The servile person is usually servile as a matter of temperamental disposition, a kind of spiritless disposition, whereas real humility is born of the Spirit. It is born of a personal encounter with God. It is based on an awareness of our metaphysical situation as creatures of God. Well, let's examine these claims a little more closely. The humble person has indeed a sense of being small, a certain sense of his own nothingness. But we have to take care not to interpret this sense of smallness in a merely quantitative way, in relation to the billions of years of cosmic time, and in relation to the vast space taken up by the billions of galaxies. Each of us is infinitesimally small, a mere speck in the immensities of space and time. But to realize this speck-like character of our existence, to feel lost in the cosmos, almost annihilated by its immensity, does not make us humble. Rather, it drives us to despair and strips us of our sense of existing as persons. True humility is something entirely different. Pay close attention in the text of Hildebrand to the personalist account of humility that he gives. The humble person, as we just said, encounters not just an unimaginably vast cosmos, but a personal God, Deus videns et vivens, the living and seeing God. The humble person, in fact, encounters the God of Christian revelation, the Father of Jesus Christ. This is the God who searches the heart, who calls each of us by name, the God to whom we are answerable, the God who knows when I sit and when I stand, who knows my thoughts from afar, even before they are formed on my tongue. Von Hildebrand thinks that it is only in the setting of this Christian personalism that Christian humility makes sense at all. Now, in our encounter with the living God of Christian revelation, two things happen in our self-understanding. Firstly, we encounter ourselves as radically dependent on God, as subject to God, as created out of nothing, as under his judgment. And that is the beginning of humility. But secondly, in this encounter, we come alive as persons. We discover a weight of glory in ourselves as persons an image of God, and that too belongs to humility. I hope you noticed in reading this chapter on humility that von Hildebrand speaks of the audacity of humility. With that, he is referring to the audacity that is needed to accept this weight of glory, willing to live in intimate dialogue with the triune God. Now, suppose I were to say, wait just a minute to be called by name by the Lord, to live before his face, to receive a mission from him, to carry out a task that only I can carry out. That is all too great for me. I'm content to leave this lofty vocation to other more ambitious souls, and for my part, to live in more modest dimensions. Would I be being humble in saying this? Von Hildebrand says that being humble is living in the truth. And if I really have a weight of glory, if I really bear an image of God, if this is the very truth of my being, then audaciously accepting this is humility. To shrink away from the truth about myself is a pseudo-humility. It's a kind of willfulness that wraps itself in the mantle of humility. Consider the Annunciation. Would Our Lady have been humble if she had declined to cooperate with the angel, saying that she just wanted to be a devout, simple Galilean woman and did not feel up to the task of being a major protagonist in the drama of salvation history? Her yes was an eminent example of humility in all its audacity. Von Hildebrand discusses another kind of pseudo-humility that is just as depersonalizing as the one we're discussing. Sometimes people think that they are in God as a spark is in a fire, or like a drop of water is in the ocean. They think in pantheistic terms about themselves and God. It's a conception of humility based on part and whole. They think of themselves as small parts within the divine whole. They think that this captures the smallness that goes with humility, while it preserves the dignity that we have in God. Von Hildebrand discerns two big flaws in this way of thinking. First, as parts of God, we are taken to be literally divine. We are not creatures, but gods. But humility is nothing if not the experience of our creaturehood. And secondly, as parts of God, we are eliminated as persons. For a person is nothing if not a being of his own, capable of acting through himself in freedom. This is why a person can never exist as an extension of another being, as a property of another, as a mere part of another. So this pantheistic conception of God and man divinizes man on the one hand and depersonalizes him on the other. The result is a wreck of real humility. We can discern in von Hildebrand's thought on humility a theme that runs through all of his thought. He never asserts the greatness and glory of God at the expense of the creature. He never demeans the creature as a way of enhancing the glory of God. He is often in opposition to what he calls religious nihilism, by which he means a sense of God so strong as to blot out the worth of the human creature. He explains in the chapter on humility how it is that the glory of God and the dignity of man are dialectically interwoven so that you depreciate God the Creator by depreciating man as creature, and glorify God by fully doing justice to the weight of glory borne by each human person. So we could say that there is, in von Hildebrand, a profound Christian humanism. So to conclude, there is much in his treatment of humility that I have not touched on. For instance, he meditates on the humility of Christ as a way of explaining the humility to which we are called. Thus he meditates on Christ emptying himself and taking the form of a slave, and on Christ as washing the feet of the disciples at the Last Supper. He wants to say to us, we who follow the Lord are called to empty ourselves in a similar way. But von Hildebrand teaches us something very important when he shows that this self-emptying has nothing to do with self-disdain. Rather, the self-emptying of humility coheres with gratitude for the image of God that is inscribed in our being. Thank you. All right. So.
And thank you to all of our panelists. And we have plenty of time, almost 40 minutes for questions. So I think there's a microphone somewhere back there. Someone have that? And raise your hand high, and the microphone will be brought to you. Maybe start there. That's fine.
Hi there. I really liked your thoughts and paradigm of Hildebrandian thinking of civility and incivility. I was wondering, in terms of like capital punishment, would that be more on regards to the side of incivility or civility?
I know this topic is a little bit controversial. I think the church is pretty clear, or has become clearer on this in the last couple of years. It seems to me that no matter what sorts of acts a person has committed, as heinous as they might be, that person retains his intrinsic dignity and ought to be treated as such. Executing a criminal, supposing we're able to contain him, at least as we are in the West, in the United States, does seem to be uncivil to me. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, it's. I would quite concur with that. It's just maybe the term uncivil is a bit weak. If capital punishment is an unjust thing, perhaps a person really innocent of the crime is destroyed in capital punishment. To speak of that as an incivility seems to be a little too weak. Civil and uncivil seem to belong in a somewhat different context. Yeah.
My question percolated in my mind when, Beth, you were speaking, and perhaps it was answered as John was speaking, so I'll ask it, but maybe really what I'm asking for is a restatement. In any case, I was thinking of Aristotle and the high regard he has for the virtue of magnanimity. It's sort of at the peak of the natural moral virtues in his account. And one way of describing magnanimity, or the virtue of having great soul, is to say we're talking about the person who thinks he is worthy of great things and is correct in that assessment. So this is the person who has an underlying base of virtues and a self-awareness of those virtues, right? The self-awareness point is what I want to focus on here, of course. But then we have this affirmation from Hildebrand and others that to reflect on one's own virtue is to eviscerate it. So the question is simply, is there any way of rescuing Aristotle's regard for magnanimity or reconciling it with Hildebrand's perspective on humility?
Well, yeah, I've always read Aristotle as fundamentally incompatible with Christian humility, not just Hildebrandian humility. There's a sense of disdain and contempt for people below the magnanimous man that is hardly Christian. So I would think that there's a sense of self and even a certain self-glory combined with a certain looking down on peasants, moral peasants, that yields a so-called Aristotelian virtue that it seems to me that it's right here. It's something like Aristotelian magnanimity that one sees a certain overthrow of pagan morality by the force of Christian revelation. So maybe you think I'm being too hard on Aristotle with that judgment, and we don't want to turn it into a seminar on Aristotle, but Beth brought up the point that Van Hildebrand says the humble person never is conscious of his or her excellence, and I seem to be saying somewhat the opposite, that there is this awareness of this weight of glory and image of God. But I think the Hildebrandian statement about not being conscious refers to the moral excellences of a person. He thinks that it's dangerous to dwell on, and certainly sounds very strange to think that I take delight, in my generosity or patience or humility. I can take delight in those virtues in another, but it doesn't work with regard to myself. So that sort of turning a blind eye to myself refers, I think, really to the moral virtues, but this image of God, which is not a thing of moral virtue exactly, this image of God in ourselves, this thing of being known and loved and called by God, that, of course, we quite rightly are fully aware of, and that is certainly part of humility, to keep that awareness alive, I would think. But,
I think I'd like to try to save something of Aristotle's magnanimity here. So setting aside the disdain for those who are lower and setting aside any direct seeking of honor for one's virtue, I do think there's an element of truthfulness in magnanimity. So here's a man who is great, does excel in the moral virtues. Perhaps he's aware of it, but doesn't navel gaze, isn't constantly congratulating himself about his status. And he would be correct about the kinds of virtues that he has. So perhaps I don't want to, I don't know if I want to say, the Blessed Virgin Mary is kind of the paradigmatic case of this. So I think she would recognize the great gift that the Lord has given her in her excellence and in being chosen to be the mother of God. And her response is, "My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord." So what does she do? She doesn't magnify herself, but she magnifies the Lord. And that's maybe humility is lacking as a virtue in Aristotle, but it seems that it is good to be aware of what God has given one, the infused virtues, moral greatness, and other gifts, and then to glorify the Lord in that rather than to glorify oneself.
John, I wonder if I might ask for a clarification on something you just said. So you said, and it seems right, that we don't take pleasure in our own virtues, right? Like if I stand up here and talk to you about how humble I am and take pleasure in that's obviously inconsistent with virtue. But do you think it's virtuous to take pleasure in the virtuous act? So, like, I enjoy being generous to people, or I enjoy, say, being courageous, or I enjoy things more when I am temperate. Not in the sense that I'm like thinking about my virtue and enjoying the fact that I'm virtuous, but I enjoy actually performing that virtue. Do you think that's consistent with Hildebrandian humility?
Yeah, I think as long as the generosity is completely fixed on the person whom you are generously serving, that it would make Hildebrandian sense. It would be that reflection on oneself and on the moral splendor of one's own character that would be a kind of poison for that moral character. But no, I think that what you, does that seem like a reasonable clarification? Yeah.
I have 3 points, but I'll try to put them very briefly. Can you hear me? Is it? Oh, no? Okay. The first one is to Professor Crosby, and my question would be, you said at one point that humility, the genuine humility Hildebrand talks about, arises in the Christian context. My question would be, and I agree with you that this Gnostic account or the atheistic account doesn't really allow for that genuine humility to come about, but my question would be to the Judaistic perspective. Another way how to ask the question, is the difference between the Trinitarian account of God and, let's say, the traditional one in the Old Testament, is it so big that the humility would not be able to have its genuine place here? I would rather tend to say no, and maybe we can expand it, but I would be interested in your thoughts on that. And then I have 2 points to Beth. The first one is related to pride, and you said at certain point that pride is based on value blindness. And when I was editing this text on the roots of moral evil, I was thinking about that, and I maybe some more specification is necessary here, because value blindness is defined by Hildebrand as simple privation of the perception of value. But what we find in prideful attitude towards values, like in the satanic pride, Hildebrand says there is an attempt to enthrone the values. But to have this attitude, you have to perceive something of values, so there must be some kind of perception of values, but a completely distorted perception of them, where only one aspect probably is seen, and this is the sovereignty of the value, which is then seen as as a threat to your own pride. So that would be the question, whether, and it's a very interesting question, what kind of perception it is. And then just the third point is very quick. You asked the question why we should put, as it were, the veil on our virtues, and that was the.
I didn't understand.
We should not be thinking of our virtues. We should, and this point was already discussed here. My guess, but it's not a full response, but my guess is that Hildebrand is, for him, the second worst type of pride is the Pharisaic attitude, which is precisely the attitude that you are proud of your moral status and moral virtue. So my comment is that maybe that is part of the response, that he sees this really to being really the second worst form of pride, to be really cherishing in your moral status and take in that really, take it as the source of your self-esteem.
Well, certainly I think, in the Psalms and in the Jewish tradition, you have all the main elements of Hildebrandian humility. So his affirmation is that outside of the orbit of Judeo-Christian revelation, you don't have a basis, you don't have really a sufficient reason for humility. So he thinks that Socrates, whom he so revered, is not yet a candidate for humility. He doesn't have that sense of God without which we cannot be humble. But certainly one wouldn't want to, he does not, I think, restrict in any way humility to, Trinitarian Christianity. But he sees it there already in the Old Testament and in that revelation of the living God of the Old Testament.
Okay, wonderful questions and comments. Thank you. To the second question about value blindness, I think you're right in some cases that the prideful person perhaps does perceive a value, and then maybe there's a deliberate turning away. So a refusal to respond. I see it and I refuse. Maybe that's one kind. But I think there are other kinds of pride where the value blindness, I think, is actually not seeing the value. And maybe that's because the person approaches the world as a consumer. And in that way, he doesn't perceive the value that's intrinsic to the thing, but only sees, what is this going to do for me? How is this going to further my projects? And so the value is just, it's not evident to that person at all. He doesn't hear the call of the value and therefore doesn't respond. So I agree, maybe we need to be a little bit more fine-grained about this. There are different types of pride and hearing the call of values and not for different reasons. So thank you, I appreciate that.
So a question directed at Beth. As I was listening to your analysis of civility and incivility, a lot of the descriptions of civility, having reverence for the value of the other, a humility in the face of the other, responding to the value of this person as a person. It sounds a lot like love, Mm-hmm. So I was asking myself the question, what's the differentia between civility and just love? And maybe the answer is civility just is what love looks like in the public sphere or something like that. But then it occurred to me that I would have thought antecedently that civility would be a species of justice rather than a species of love. So I was hoping maybe you could speak to that, and maybe what's the special sauce of civility as a particular attitude? What is the civil, the civitas part of it? What work is that doing? Is it something other than just respecting one another? Mm-hmm.
Excellent question. I don't know that I have thought through this sufficiently to answer it now, but maybe the first thing that comes to mind is a key term that Jim brought up earlier. Maybe coincidences of opposites isn't quite the right term, but things that go together or maybe become somewhat one in God, love and justice. So I think the way I was framing it was that civility is a kind of love. It would be under the umbrella of love, but I can see what you're saying, that it pertains to justice, what is due to another person. But the way Hildebrand seems to talk about it at certain times is that love is the proper, love is due. And maybe it's the case that Christianity calls for that. It elevates that responsibility that we have to other people. So sort of at a minimum level, depending on the office of the relationship, to my fellow citizens, what do I owe? Civility, and perhaps other things too. But say to your wife, you owe a lot more than civility, right? It would be deep love of friendship.
If I could just kind of push it one step further. It does seem that there's a little bit of a difference. We talk about what's owed or due. There seems to be a character of gift in love that's not present in justice. If I have an obligation of justice, it's simply non-negotiable. I have to. Whereas there's an element of I have to love my neighbor. I must. But it still seems to have some kind of quality of giftedness. It's not demanded. I'm searching for the right language, but I hope you track what I'm saying. So does civility belong more in that character of its, in some way, a gift that we offer to our fellow citizens, or is it fall more on that side of an absolute condition for the possibility of a just society or something?
Yeah, while I'd like to think more about that, the way that you frame it seems to suggest that it's part of justice. But I'd like to think about that more and maybe continue the conversation. Thanks, Dan.
Maybe if I could add one thing that would bring out maybe a dimension of love, incivility. What seems to me to be conspicuously missing in all this uncivil behavior and name-calling is the refusal to enter with empathy into the point of view of the other. You know, the civility, you take the wind out of the sails of the uncivil person as soon as you invite him to see the issue from the point of view of his adversary. But that readiness to empathize, there is an element of love in that. So I think the counterweight to incivility that you want to retrieve out of the Hildebrand does include love in the form of this readiness to enter with empathy into the other.
I wonder if I'm going to cut the line, and then we'll get to the other. My prerogative as moderator. Elisa, I had a question for you about Nietzsche. So you read that marvelous passage about Christian humility is the attitude of the things creeping on the earth. I love Nietzsche. He writes so marvelously. And your response, which I think is sort of a standard Christian response to Nietzsche, is Nietzsche gets humility wrong. Right? He misunderstands Christian humility. And I always wonder about this, and I think this ties into things that all of you said, actually. I wonder if there is a sort of servile aspect of Christian humility. Like our Lord tells us to take the lowest place. Even if you maybe do deserve a higher place, right? You go to the wedding banquet and maybe you do deserve to be up at the head of the table, but you take the lowest place, right? And you receive the higher as a gift. So do you think that there is that aspect of Christian humility, a sort of lowering oneself below one's proper place, such that we might say, like, Nietzsche exaggerates, as he always does, but maybe Nietzsche got Christian humility right in some respects, and he's just a prideful, value-blind person and can't see the worthwhileness of taking the lowest place.
Okay, so I had no time to explain all the history of the concept of humility, which I think is very, very interesting, starting from the Ancient Testament, because also there is a change, of course, in Christianity with the medieval age and etc. And I think that, it's really curious because it is possible to read a change of perspective, so a change to intend the word humility, considering the anthropological way in which it's located in the historical time. So I found the words of Nietzsche very strong, and there are others also in some curious dictionary. You can find a definition of humility bizarre, so very strange. But I do not, I never, so looking at the history of the concept, if I have to think to the Christian humility, it has a positive exception. So I think we can find the perspective of Nietzsche because there was a change, of course, in the way to intend the human being. So it's really related. And also in the modernity, the exception changed. So that's why I found it very curious. Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you. Do you have it? Okay.
I had a quick question too, for all three of you. Hildebrand, this is kind of an undercurrent to what you've been talking about here. Hildebrand talks about three spiritual centers of the person: the free and loving center, pride, and concupiscence. And he comments that pride can exist on its own, isn't satanic pride, but he also comments that concupiscence always has an element of pride in it. We've heard a lot about pride today, but maybe there are one or two people in the room who have the same experience as I do, which is I am far more likely to fall into concupiscence than I am into a bald, naked kind of pride. So I'd be interested in hearing from you how reverence and humility play out versus that more concupiscent center of the person, which in many ways is more present and more tempting and more a stumbling block than that naked kind of pride is.
Yeah, well, maybe we should think about subtle, hidden forms of pride, like a feeling of resentment if somebody doesn't praise me as much as he praises my colleague. It needn't be, the satanic raving, but it can be subtle, hidden, and toxic. And so maybe that's part of real Christian spirituality, is getting sensitized to these, or there are different ways of expecting, having expectations that are unreasonable and involve a certain prideful self-assertion. And the real Christian, fully transformed in Christ, is liberated from that. But I think it's maybe all the more dangerous for being subtle and hidden, the different forms of pride that we have to deal with, and which interfere with our growth in humility. I don't know, maybe you all can think of good examples of pride that makes it not such, a rare thing for a few moral monsters, but something that we're all, struggling with and have to bring into our examination of conscience every day.
Yeah, I think that subtle forms of pride and concupiscence are very closely related. So this goes back to the consumer mentality that I talked about before, which I think we are liable to fall prey to pretty frequently. So bound up with that is not recognizing that the intrinsic value, that something might be important in itself, but rather approaching it in terms of how does it satisfy me. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a kind of a homely example of just approaching a person. You're working on a team with somebody, and rather than respecting the person and the gifts that they bring, just kind of seeing, well, what can they do for me? What can they do to further my projects? Something like that. I don't know, it seems that we fall prey to these things in really simple kinds of ways all the time.
Yeah. And ways of looking down on other people, I think, are expressions of pride that may easily pass unnoticed or not be, conspicuous for their moral ugliness, and yet different forms of scorn and contempt, like in the magnanimous man, as I was saying earlier, certainly are a kind of pride that deforms the person and are incompatible, I would think, with humility. Yeah.
I have a question, gathering what I've gleaned in what you were saying. It's almost as if pride is you almost are saying that I am instead of God being the I am. But under that, we have look at my honors, look at my riches. Those are the steps that go to the bigger pride, perhaps, in the values. What is my gain, or look at me because I have these virtues. And if there's that sort of ranking from like my honor, my riches to the I am instead of God is, do you find that Hildebrand on the other side of it, like Nietzsche was saying, humility is crawling around on the bottom? Would you say that Hildebrand is almost saying that humility is the bedrock to almost like all the other beatitudes and of conforming to Christ's life? Because I'm hearing this developmental thing as we grow through the smaller things to concupiscences to like the satanic pride. Is there actually almost a ranking to the beatitudes and humility being the bedrock in what Hildebrand's saying? Yeah.
Well, he does say of reverence as Elisa quoted that he sees reverence as the mother of all virtues. So that fundamental self-emptying of reverence is foundational for. So humility might be more like the highest flower of Christian virtue, and reverence more the foundational thing. That, I think, is perhaps according to his mind. What do you all think?
I'm not sure about ranking the Beatitudes, but I think I agree with what you're saying regarding humility here. So, I mean, with humility, we're focused on who God is and who am I with respect to God, which, as I said, there's this huge abyss between God and me. And so that's at the foundation, right, of the Beatitudes, which put us, I mean, ultimately the goal is ascending the mountain, as Jim said. It's communion with God and recognizing the gap that's between us.
Maybe to come back to Jim's question about the more hidden forms of pride, take the case of, let's say, failing at something. I go into a class and it comes off poorly. And so there's a way of being angry at myself, flagellating myself. What a fool you made of yourself. And that, it doesn't take much spiritual discernment to see that reeks of pride. As if I ought to, as if it befits me always only to deliver, the most eloquent classes and lectures. And so when I fail, so the humble response would be, well, what do you expect, You've got these lofty standards of perfection. Of course you can't come close to them. And now you have to throw yourself more on the mercy of God than before. That would be, the humble response to a kind of everyday pride that is at work.
I had a quick question. This is more to Professor Crosby, but I think you've all kind of talked about it. So like in the servile or the false humility of like, I don't want to grasp at this thing I'm called to. Would you say it's more of a pride, like a subtle pride, as in like, I've done horrible things, or I'm not good enough for this, and I don't want to accept this gift of a responsibility. I don't want to be indebted to God for this. Or do you think it's more of like that servility, that like focus on the servility of like, I'm too much of a coward, I can't do this?
Yeah.
Kind of think, is it a little bit of both? Do you think it's more of one or the other?
Yeah. Interesting probing question. I don't know what you all would say, but maybe it varies from, maybe there is a kind of refusal of the divine call that's cowardly and lazy, and therefore more a thing of concupiscence, or a refusal that doesn't like to be in this subordinate position in relation to God, and doesn't want to take on a task that is imposed and to which I'm held. So there can be a prideful resentment of that call, or a lazy, concupiscent way of turning away from it.
Thinking of the priest at Holy Mass raises up the chalice and the consecrated host and says, "Behold the Lamb of God." And then we say, "Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof, but only say the word and my soul shall be healed." And the Lord is inviting us there to the banquet, and he is saying to us, worthy, when he offers that invitation. And then wouldn't it be the height of humility to say, oh, no, I could never receive that gift? Or perhaps in your situation, The Lord may be calling you to holy orders, and you say, "Oh, I could never do that. Look at what I've done in the past, or look at, I don't have this gift or that gift or whatever." But if the Lord is calling you, He's calling you. And to Dr. Crosby's point about holy audacity, to humbly, accept that, and then recognize that that is God's gift to you, and accept it rather than refuse. It would be prideful, I think, to refuse if the Lord is clearly calling.
So if it's possible, I permit to go back to the previous question by you, to add a little thing, because so reverence, I told in the presentation, is the mother of all moral life. And I think it's important to underline that it's possible to speak about reverence because it's possible to intend reverence as when a person is full of an esteem for another one, okay? And so I'm reverent, and I became humble. So I can be humble in front of the other person. And I wish to underline what Maria told us yesterday during a dialogue about teaching personalism. Yeah, she really struck what she says. I don't know where she is now. Anyway.
She had to step out.
Anyway. And she told us that in teaching personalism, the first thing is love, and then the concept of the person. And exactly the same thing here, because otherwise being humble became a sort of, duty. And Nietzsche will also be right, saying that, it's something also cool, okay, being humble, something very, okay. But in the other sense, if I put at the first level, reverence as really full of estimation for another person, then it's possible also to speak to being humble. So I really find the relation between these two concepts at the base of all virtues and all of moral life in Hildebrand. But it's very interesting because it starts really in a human way, so that's what.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. This is two-part. Hopefully I can do it really quickly. First, when a point of clarification or a question of clarification regarding the recognition in man regarding virtue, it would seem that we would first establish what the Lord does for us or has done for us, and then also what our part is in it. It seems as though the Lord has given us natural gifts already. That'd be one. Two, in our fallen nature, there's some sort of remaining participation in the gift and receiving others as gift. I'm thinking of particularly JP2's Theology of the Body, original solitude, innocence, and nakedness. There's some kind of, the light has not completely gone out regarding John chapter 1. And then thirdly, of course, the Lord redeems us, and this is the work we can see the Lord doing in us. And then, of course, on our part, there is cooperation and then participation. So I guess really these days, it would seem that we would recognize what the Lord is truly doing in us, and that this virtue is coming, of course, from the fruit that Christ lives in us. And then secondly, to the first speaker, I had a question of, I think you said either reverence or humility is the ontology of identity. I would like to hear more about that.
I refer to this publication. It's an issue headed by me 5 years ago. We collected some papers, so you can maybe find. It's Recherche Philosophique, is the University of Toulouse. And I on that time, I wanted to underline the fact that being humble constitutes the person. And so in this sense, it's an ontology of the identity, because it's not like a tabula rasa in the Cartesian sense, so in the sense that I approach reality without having any other information, something like this, but in the sense that to approach the reality, the premise is exactly being humble in the way as I underlined before, to grasp a concept, to affirm and to respond to them, to moral values. In this sense, I think that humility constitutes really, is the real background, that is our real background, is the base of the person, and the ontology of the identity in this sense. Is like the premise of the name that we want to assume in our life as for the vocation and so on. Yeah, it's important. Well, it's not like in the Cartesian sense that has to be clear. So this tabula rasa, not in the Cartesian sense, but in the sense that is really the condition that permit the real knowledge. And it's curious that Hildebrand underlined as the premise, a sort of premise of knowledge, to real understand reality, to go to the essence of each single thing. Is an advantage, so something is an advantage for a person in knowledge. So.
Yeah. I know we're right at the end of the session, but I wanted Mark to come back to that interesting question you raised. I think you merit more of a response than you've gotten. You asked, doesn't Christ tell us to take the lowest place? And so Nietzsche isn't really wrong when he says that Christians are out to, always lower themselves. But think about the way in which Christ lowers himself when at the Last Supper he washes the feet of the disciples. And when you look at that unimaginable act of the Lord humbling himself before the disciples, you don't notice any trace of servility. What I see is a sovereign freedom in which the Lord, without forgetting who he is, steps down to the level of the apostles. So none of that spiritlessness, that weakness or cowardice. Rather, you see a coinciding of a sovereign divine freedom with this emptying of himself and taking the role of a slave. And so that, I think, helps us to see that Christian humility is not the ugly, servile thing that Nietzsche thought it was.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our speakers.